Welcome to the channel, everybody. My name's Alex. I'm the N-Scale reviewer. Today I want to talk to you about how I get prototypical lighting with my ESU equipped units. So there was a time long ago when I was much more familiar with CV changing and using that to control my prototypical lighting. Years ago, I put out a video on how I program my TCS stuff to do things similar to what I'm doing with these ESU units. The initial cost of getting a Lokprogrammer is a little bit scary and difficult to swallow, but it can function as a PC interface for most things, and so after making the purchase, I don't regret it because the usability that you get from the Lokprogrammer, especially once you have one or two sound-equipped locomotives, for example, it can be really game-changing. Especially lately, I have been having more units come with sound files that aren't necessarily properly set up, so it's definitely a requirement once you break a threshold of a certain number of sound locomotives. And so I've definitely hit that point, and since kind of delving into it, I did a few personal installs. I've really kind of refined how I use my lighting and got it functioning really well. I want to walk you guys through how I do that. Now I have these kind of tied down so they won't move, so hopefully everything stays in focus. What I've got this set up currently as is in road mode. All you have to do is have your function 0 active. And with most systems, unlike the TCS one I've got now, some of the functionality of what you send to your lead locomotive versus your secondary locomotives can change. So this is kind of set up for, I believe NCEU can do this. I'm not sure about Digitrax. And TCS, you can actually control what functions get sent to the engines in your consist. Okay, so we're going to start with the Canadian Pacific unit on the right. It's currently set up in road unit mode. So all I have active currently is function 0. And you'll see that the light is currently dim. I also have function 7 activated currently. And function 7 is kind of my universal ditch light function. Most scale trains units and a lot of Atlas units come with it set up as function 6. It's a little more difficult to change on the Broadway units. So if I want to be able to use everything else with my Broadway units, I'd like to just move everything to function 7 so it's consistent across the board. It also is a little bit easier with some other things. So it's just my personal preference. You can do whatever you want. So now if I just add a little bit of forward, you'll see that the lights brightened and my ditch lights automatically came off. And if I bring it back to 0, and we're back to dim. So again, bright, dim. So there is essentially Rule 17 lighting with functioning headlight or ditch lights. And I will get to how I do all of this on the computer afterwards. And feel free to, if none of that makes sense, just screenshot everything I've got there. And for the most part, it will be the same across the board with all Atlases and scale trains. You might have to mess with the functions a little bit, but it's relatively easy to set up at that point. So now I'm going to switch around the Canadian Pacific unit. So you're looking at the rear, and we'll go over how that looks in a moment. Okay, so I have the Canadian Pacific unit switched around. Let's go ahead and just change its directions. And you'll see that the tail light is dim and my ditch lights are also dim. And if I go ahead and give it some throttle, you'll see that the ditch lights brightened and the rear headlight brightened. And then we're dim again. Rule 17, we just stopped, give it some throttle, and boom, they both pop up. This is the setup I use for some things if I want to have dimming ditch lights. I don't think it's very prototypical, but it is something you can do if you're not using grade crossing. Because grade crossing requires your function to be set up as a ditch light that alternates, it doesn't have the dimmable ability, at least yet. It might be a feature that comes in the future, but as of currently, the only way to get dimmable ditch lights is to run them as so. You set them up as a dimmable headlight, which means they will not flash if that's a thing for you, but they will dim down just like your headlight will. Those other ones were grade crossing style ditch lights. However, the Canadian Pacific unit, they do not alternate. So I set them up to just turn off when I bring the unit to a stop. So most things that I've seen is when you turn your headlight on, it's dim, then high, and then high with ditch lights. So I would think the more prototypical application would be when you turn down your headlights too dim, the ditch lights just turn off. So that's usually how I run them. Now let's go ahead and jump into the units that are directly adjacent to it. So I have this Trainmaster right here and this SD9 right here, and they are set up in consist. So let's go ahead and pull them up. Okay, so we've got these units sitting here, and currently they're consisted together tail to tail. So the headlights would face in opposite directions when it comes to them in a switching application. This unit does not have ditch lights, so we don't have to go over any of that, but it is set up with something slightly different than the Canadian Pacific unit next to it. As you noticed, those were dimmable headlights. So when you moved the function to forward, they automatically got full brightness. This particular unit is using Rule 17 as well. However, when I give it full forward, you'll see that it slowly brightens and slowly dims back down. And should I turn the function off, it kind of flickers and shuts off. It's not just an immediate on. This is what they call a fade in, fade out headlight. This is something if you're running an older unit that would have an incandescent style light and you wanted to maintain that look, it can be done. There is one caveat to it that I will show you when we move a little bit deeper into how I have these set up. Now, I do not want to have to access my secondary unit to control its lighting when connected to my lead unit. So 4810 right here, which is the one in the center, is my lead unit. And I believe this is 601, my Montana rail link sitting next to it, is the secondary unit. So the driver would not be in this particular unit. So if I want the lights to be on in this for switching purposes, all I have to do is put these in switching mode. So if I press my function 4, these are now both in switching mode, which means the speed that they are capable of running at is cut in half, and my lights are now set up the way I have these configured to be in switching mode. So if I try to move forward, which this is forward currently, you'll see that my lead unit is strong enough to drag an engine, oddly. The lights brighten, but my tailing unit, they did not brighten. Now if I switch the direction and run them in reverse, you'll notice my lead unit's lights did not brighten. They stayed dim the whole time. So in this particular setup, you would not be able to brighten the trailing engine's lights remotely. So only the lead engine can have a brightening light, so only in the forward direction. Now, if I wanted to use these units separate from one another, so say I just had one unit, I could put them in single switching mode. And how I do that is I just activate function 3. And now I've activated function 3. So if I take this unit and flip it around, you will see that the tail light is dim. The way I set this up is if I want these to run in a prototypical application similar to how I've seen some of my BNSF units run around here, where it's dim all the time while doing yard work, all I have to do is turn off my function 0. And as you can see there, anytime you change direction with the dimmable headlight, it resets itself. So you'll see that little flicker in there. So that's something that I don't necessarily like. But currently, I only have function 3 and function 4 running on this unit. So no matter what direction I choose to go, whether it is forward or reverse, all the lights on this unit will stay dim all the time. If I turn back on my function 0, so now I have function 0 active on this, and this is the unit I'm running. Although still consistent to this, it doesn't matter. I just activated function 3. With function 4 turned on, I have my switcher mode, and function 3, it turns this into a single unit switcher mode, so both lights are running all the time. If you reactivate function 0, at that point, you then have Rule 17 forward and reverse lighting. So if I switch this unit to reverse, you'll see that I'm dim, and I roll forward, it will brighten right up and come to a stop, and it'll dim back down. And then if I switch to the forward position, again, I'm in dim, and I brighten up as I pull forward. And of course, I didn't quite get it back on the track. But that is how that works. So this will function with any unit that I have set up this way. Matter of fact, I can jump to 4600 and turn on function 4. And you'll notice that my rear lights, even though I'm in reverse, just turned off. Because I activated function 4, this is set up to be a tail-to-tail switcher. If I put it on the track, you'll see that the headlight is dim, and in reverse, the tail light or the headlight stays dim. If I change directions now, it will brighten back up and go the other way. Also notice that even though I have function 7 activated, my ditch lights don't work. I have to physically turn off my yard mode before my ditch lights will turn back on. I can turn function 4 back on, and I can hit function 3, and now, without changing anything, I'll just bring this to a stop. You'll see dim light. I'll just set it back on there, and I have a dim light. If I swap that to reverse and give it forward, and there we are, I have bright light. Set up all the same. One other feature that I do build into these engines, although they don't necessarily need it, if you turn off all of your lighting functions, so now we're completely turned off, I'm going to switch the unit to go forward. So just so you can see, I'm moving forward just like that, just a little bit. If I press function 5, I will get a dim rear light. So this acts as if it is a DPU unit at the end of an engine, and you have your end of train lighting. So that is how I achieve that. And there I'm trying to move forward. As you can see, it is actually trying to move forward. I just have an engine in its way. And that is a rear dim, and we'll shut that off. All right, now we will go ahead and jump into the computer. I will show you how I achieve all of this and kind of some of the settings you can do to make that function properly. Okay, so now we're in the Lokprogrammer software, and the first thing you're going to want to do is come up here and import any of your decoder settings using the green arrow. This will take everything that's currently on your decoder and move it in here so you can start to make a change. Now, if you have a blank decoder, you're going to want to get a sound project and get that uploaded with whatever that happens to be. In this case, we're running a GP40, so I would get a GP40 sound file to my liking. I would then go ahead and use the sound file transfer to write it to the unit. And once that's completed, you're going to find yourself kind of in this location. If this is the first time you're using your decoder, go ahead and jump to your address, use the long address, and set it for the road number of your choosing, in which case this already matches my unit. This unit's already been set up, and I just kind of want to go through everything that I showed you on the previous video. From here, there's a few things you're going to want to change right off the bat. These things we'll cover in a future video on how to get these things running as smoothly as possible. But for right now, we're really worried about our function outputs and our function mapping. So the first thing you're going to want to do is jump in here and see from factory or default what functions are currently available to you. Most of them will have front light 1, rear light 2, and a couple of auxiliary functions that are programmable. I'm not quite sure when, but it seems like Lokprogrammer 08, we're at like 5.02, so 5.08. It seems like auxiliary 1 got dual functionality, which could be useful in some other applications. But for the purposes of setting up this locomotive, the things you'll need to know is you'll need your headlight and your tail light. You're going to need to know where your ditch lights, in this case it's aux 5, 6, 7, and 8, and potentially if you have any other ones. So say, for example, some of the scale trains units are coming with function programmable number boards. You're going to want to be able to turn those on and off or leave them on all the time depending on how you want to set things up. From this page, when you saw my two units, there's two different types of headlights that you have available to you. There's a dimmable headlight, and then there's a dimmable fade in and out headlight. And what this means by dimmable is you have the function capability of running the dimmer. And if you only have a headlight and taillight on your unit, that's really all you need to achieve function or Rule 17 lighting. The way that I do this is different, because when you set up Rule 17 and then you have a rear light on all the time or headlight on all the time in certain situations, it's very difficult to match the LED light output from Rule 17, the automatic dimming, to where you set the lower light level. So I just bypass Rule 17 altogether, and I program in a secondary light at a dim level. And in this case, these modern LED lights that are coming on these Lokprogrammer boards seem to be relatively insensitive to voltage change. So full light is obviously the brightest, and your secondary light, you usually have to get it pretty low before it gets dim enough to be considered a dim light, in my opinion. So while we're going through this, as long as you're here, go to your front headlight. You need to activate Rule 17 and forward to make this a dimmable light. If you are just using the headlight, like a road unit where only the front light is on, and you want Rule 17, you can just activate the dimmer, and it basically just works out of the box. Where I want to have a switching mode, that's not necessarily the case. In this section, you just want to make sure that you have your LED on your low light. I don't like, per se, running the dimmable headlight with the fade in, fade out. The Southern Pacific unit that I had shown up there, that Trainmaster, it'll fade on and fade out, and it looks okay, except when you're changing directions, there's kind of a flash to the light, and it's really not my thing. So I really prefer to run most of my units in the dimmable headlight function, so it just automatically jumps to bright or automatically jumps to dim. Now, within this unit, if you have alternating ditch lights, you need to make sure that you have these set up properly. So your ditch lights, in my case, are aux 5.6 for the front and 7.8 for the rear. If you want to have alternating ditch lights, you need to set one or the other to have a phase shift of 32. And this is exactly 50% off from the other one. Now, you can adjust this one way or the other to kind of have them overlap a little bit, but I prefer just running it right dead center. And you also need to have grade crossing enabled. Of course, we're running LEDs, so make sure that's enabled. But as long as you choose ditch light 1, you're okay. That's when you activate the function, the ditch lights are on. When you hit the horn, they start to flash. Ditch light number 2 is the opposite. They're off, and if you hit the horn, they will start to flash. Now, on my rear, I showed you something a little bit different. I have these set up as a dimmable headlight. They do not flash back and forth. They're just standard ditch lights. And so when you have a dimmer function activated, you can actually make them dim down with the headlight, so you have dim ditch lights. Now, I don't know how prototypical that is, but if you have, say, some Cato units that you are running in consist with these, where the headlight and the ditch lights are connected to the same light tube, it will look a little more consistent to those models compared, one or the other. So now where the rubber meets the road is you need to go ahead and function map all this stuff. So here's where the rubber meets the road. This is how I program my lights to work the way that they did. So the first thing you want to do is these will be set up immediately from the get-go. So your function 0 is non-transferable. It always stays with your lead locomotive. So that's something that you can use in basically any DCC control system to your advantage. So I am using function 4 as my switching mode. And if I am running in switching mode, I want to have a different lighting setup than when I'm running as a road unit. So anything that is road unit applicable, I have not function 4 as part of that, and it acts as an if-then statement. So if forward with function 0 on, I want my front light to be on bright mode. If reverse with function 0 on and function 4 not active, I want my rear headlight to be active. So moving down through here, if you were to have alternating ditch lights, this particular unit does not in the prototype, so I do not have it, but you can drop this down and you can add grade crossing. That will make anything that is set up as a ditch light 1, when activated, flash. At this point, I want to change a couple things to make these a little more fun to use. A lot of these models, especially Atlas and scale trains, have been putting the handbrake in this location. It used to be coupler, that coupling noise. I just turned that off because I use function 3 in most of my programming now as a secondary lighting function. And I'll get to that in just a minute here. And then here we are at function 4. And I have this activate switching mode. So when I put my units in switching mode, if you're unfamiliar with what this is, it cuts your throttle response by half, or a defined feature that you can actually change inside the Lokprogrammer. I just leave it at half. I set up all of my units to have at 50% throttle being running at 25 miles an hour, and at full throttle 50 miles an hour, because that's the max speed I want on my layout. So when I activate switching mode, especially like if I want to have my kid running some of my switchers, I can put him in switching mode, and now he can twist the potentiometer all the way up, and you're only at 25 scale miles per hour. And so that's a pretty cool thing. It also makes it a whole lot easier to do fine control when you're coming in to couple and decouple. Moving on to function 5, this is something that is only really used on road units, probably not switchers, but I put it in there anyway. This can be directly applied to a big road unit if you want it to. This is your function 5 rear-facing light for end of train. So if you have a DPU at the end of a train and you want a rear-facing light, as you would see prototypically, this is how you program it. So in the forward direction, with 0 or function 0 off, so I always make sure I can't accidentally turn on function 5. I have to physically make sure that the headlight is off, and then I activate function 5, and it will put my rear light on dim. Now, because there isn't a whole lot of space here, I just have to move down past function 31, and I add it again. So on this particular unit, I have it right here. So in reverse, with not function 0 and function 5 active, I have front light 2. So it's the opposite of the direction. Moving down to my ditch lights, now I have two different setups, and I'll show you how I do both. If I want my ditch lights to be off, like this one currently was, so in the forward position when you are in Rule 17, so dim at stop, you'll want to set these to be active only when the machine is moving. So you don't really have to do anything to make these turn off other than you just add a drive function. So in your drop down, you would change this from ignore to yes. If I am moving in the forward direction with F0 on, so my headlight has to be on. If I'm not in switching mode, because in switching mode, I just make sure my ditch lights are turned off completely. And I turned on function 7, which is my standard, which is my standard amongst all units. Broadways have their ditch lights on 7, and function 6 has some weird things. If I hook up with a Broadway unit, it's trying to throttle up or down, so I just move everything I have to function 7. I just like it better that way, so that's how I do it. So with function 7 active, headlight on, moving forward, my ditch lights will automatically come up to bright. Now with my rear, I actually have this normally set up for both my rear and my front, but for the sake of showing you the other options that you can do, in reverse, with function 0 on, function 4 off, and function 7 on, I will turn on my aux 7 and 8. And if I buzz down here to the bottom, I added a secondary rule to that. If I stopped in reverse with function 0 on, I'm not in switching mode, and I have my ditch lights on, I'm going to activate those same two functions, but I'm going to apply the dimmer to that. And because I'm using the dimmer, this right here, I have to make sure in my functions that I have dimmer activated. If I don't, the dimmer function will not actually work with those functions. And that's why if you're using these as phase type ditch lights, that's not an available option to you. You can't dim, at least currently within these, you can't dim these headlights with ditch light type 1 anymore. Now, if you were using a different decoder and they had your aux1 and aux2 going to, say, your ditch lights, it is possible that you could make that work. So you could set up your aux1 and your aux2 to be ditch light type 1, but in a stopped configuration. So if stopped, you could set up your aux2 parenthesis 2 and aux1 parenthesis 2 as dimmable headlights, and you could set them up at a dim light level. So that is possible, just not with this particular board, because we kind of just have to work with what functions are available to us because we're working off of the boards that are built on the light. If you were wiring this in separately, like on an HO unit, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem. So that handles both type of ditch lights. You're going to want to maintain all of this. This is all factory information. And, I forgot to tell you, on function 7, a lot of time there is flange squeal. I just take that sound out. I don't want to listen to it. I don't want it on there, so I just take it out. And then if you're looking here, a lot of times manufacturers are attaching on your function 8, so turning on your sound and starting the unit, they are attaching the functions for turning on your number board. So if you have separately lit number boards, a lot of time you're going to see it in here. I then take, if that's the case, I take those functions and I bring them down here, move them to the bottom. I would just add the functions right here, whatever they happen to be, without anything here, and they would just be lit all the time. So when there's power going to the unit, your number boards light up. If you wanted it to be a function where you had to physically turn on the function to get them to work, you can obviously just attach this to any function. Other than that, I just generally like to have them there. So that's how I do separately lit number boards. If I was going to do it, I'd probably come to, like, say, function 12, because it's usually not attached to anything. It's also relatively easy to access on most controllers, so you could definitely put it there. For the most part, I do not mess with any of this stuff. If you want to change where any of your secondary sounds are, if you want to have access to them, you're fully able to do that from this point. But for the point of the lighting, now we're going to get to the meat and bones of how I make these units actually function. So we've already determined we have Rule 17 lighting available to us, but because I want to have both lights on in a switching condition, I need to make sure that this is set up this way. So first, we already went over this, not function 4. I need to now set up the condition in which the lights dim. So with the unit stopped in the forward configuration, and again, these are all part of your drop-down menu, driving, forward condition, headlight on, function 4 off, I want this to be front light 2, and that automatically puts me at the dim portion of my headlight. Same thing for reverse. Stop, reverse direction, function 0 active, function 4 deactivated, rear light 2. Now, when I'm in my switching configuration where I have an engine tail to tail, so headlights of each engine facing both ways, I want my lead unit to have a bright light, but my non-lead unit, I don't want to get out, jump over there, and turn the bright light on while I'm switching. So it is always in a dim configuration. So if I have my F0 active and I'm in a forward configuration with F4 active, so I'm in switching mode, so that means I'm moving forward, my front light will jump up to bright. However, if I am in any other mode of movement, whether sitting still or in reverse with my F0 active, so this is my lead unit, I will then default to my dim light. So in reverse or sitting still, I'm in the dim configuration. If I start to move in the forward direction with my lead unit, it will brighten. Now, because F0 only stays with my lead unit and I'm consisted to a secondary unit, I will not have F0 on. But F4 will be transferred to that unit because it gets sent to every unit in the consist. Therefore, as soon as I have function 4 active, the front light on that unit is always dim no matter what we're doing. There's no other contingencies on this. Now, as we move down, we're going to skip this because this was the function 5 we already covered. This is the next configuration. So say I have this unit outside of a consist and I'm switching with a single unit, which means I need to have my front and rear light running simultaneously. Without function 0 turned on, I have F4 active, so I'm in switching mode, and I just hit F3 to switch to my single switcher mode, which all this does is just activate another function. It automatically puts my unit in front light dim, rear light dim. And I watch a lot of units in my area only run with dim lights all the time when they're switching. So if you wanted that, that's all you have to do is you turn on function 4 and function 3, and your lights are dim the whole time. Now, if you want to have a more active role in your switching, so you brighten in either direction, that's just how you set it up. The next thing you need to do is turn on your function 0. When you do that, and you have F4 and F3 active, we're still in switching mode, but in this condition, we're basically just sitting still. We're in dim front and dim rear. If you want your headlight to get bright as you move forward, all you have to do is add a forward to the if-then statement. So if moving forward and all 3 of these functions are active, the front light needs to be bright and the rear light needs to be dim. However, if you want to then add the reverse the same way, again, if in reverse, function 0 on and 3 and 4 active, I want my front light to be dim and my rear light to be bright. Now, when I watch units around here switch, generally, they don't run their ditch lights. And I don't know if that's a BNSF thing. I don't even know if it's correct. But adding ditch lights to some of this stuff could be a little bit more difficult. It is technically done the same way as long as you're not using grade crossing. You could potentially continue to use the one where it dims down and brightens up. This type of setup that we talked about, or you could have it turn on when you're strictly moving forward. If you want that, all you really have to do is remove the F4 right here. So this just becomes a usable function all the time. As long as you have your headlight on, your ditch lights will function. So that is how I set up all of my units so that all of my lights function in every configuration without having to jump into each and every unit while in consist and change their lighting functions. It's just automatic from whichever unit you are using as your cab.